August 6, 1945. A rented flat above a bookshop in Bloomsbury, London. Late afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, turning dust into drifting islands. The scent of boiling tea mixed with the faint metallic tang of ink and the sharper odor of a recently polished radio casing. On a narrow wooden table sat notebooks with equations, a thermos with a lipstick ring on its rim, and a folded photograph that had been handled too many times. Dr. Eleanor Hayes smoothed the corner of a page with fingers that still showed laboratory stains, while Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, whose hands had once assembled delicate glassware in Kyoto, traced a line of print as if it were a map. They wore civilian clothes, but their movements kept the economy of people trained to measure in minutes and parts per million. They had been waiting since morning, waiting for a dispatch, an acknowledgement, anything that would explain the tremor in the wires. The radio sat silent for a lullabying moment, a low hum like a distant engine, and then the announcer spoke. "If this is true," whispered Tanaka, eyes not leaving the page, "if they really used it, then what have we done?" The voice on the radio cut through the room like a precise instrument. It gave an initial clipped report. A city in Japan had suffered an explosion of unprecedented scale. Accounts from ships and missions were preliminary, official confirmation pending. The description that followed was technical enough to pierce denial, a single syllable naming an experiment turned catastrophe. The flat moved from measured breathing into a cascade of small noises. Cups set down too loudly, a chair creaked, a pencil snapped like a thread. Eleanor lifted her chin, and the conversation began not as argument, but as a series of precise, almost clinical probes that revealed the human weight inside each formula. "What did they say of the blast radius?" she asked. "The yield estimates are unreliable," Tanaka answered. "But the reports mention an intense central fire," said Arthur Reed, a voice from the corridor, as Colonel Arthur Reed stepped in wearing the stiffness of uniforms and the smell of rain on his coat. Anna Morales, a reporter, carried a notebook and the urgency of deadlines on her breath. They traded words that were at once data and allegory, and the room filled with the sound of thinkers rapidly reconfiguring a world they had thought to contain within equations. The revelation registered not only as news, but as a rupture in an epistemic boundary. The broadcast made concrete a possibility that, until then, had remained an intellectual exercise across laboratories and memos. Energy released not as light for understanding, but as destruction for strategic effect. For a group whose work had always balanced curiosity and calculation, the question moved from could to should. Dialogue became the medium of moral accounting. "We spoke of critical masses in lectures," Eleanor said softly. "We spoke of chain reactions as abstract processes. We modeled fission." "As a branch of physics," Tanaka replied. "We did not imagine cities." The exchange lengthened, each line carrying a hesitation, a gesture, the scrape of a chair, a hand going to a pocket for a cigarette and then stopping. The radio offered fragments from overseas that were at once schematic and devastating. The flat, with its books and thermal flasks, turned into a tribunal of conscience where the scientific vocabulary collided with the weight of images described by a voice over wires. To understand how they arrived at this moment requires tracing the project histories that had been both technical enterprises and moral experiments. Since 1939, a confluence of theory and circumstance had accelerated work on uranium and fission. Laboratories that had once been cosmologies of thought became factories of calculation. And institutions such as Cambridge, Berkeley, and Chicago housed conversations about isotopes, separations, and the limits of applied physics. Professor Lawrence Brooks, who had mentored Eleanor, kept meticulous binders that read like patient confessions. Michael Coates, a technician in his 20s, had spent nights calibrating instruments that measured neutron counts. At the same time, governments moved with the logic of urgency, funding experiments at an industrial scale and asking for projections of yield and reliability in return. The vocabulary shifted from question to deliverable as reports used terms like device and test and yield. Conversations that began as discussions of natural phenomenon were reframed as operations subject to timetables and strategic goals. Within this contour, there were divergences. Some advocated stricter secrecy and moral pause. Others argued for publication and practical use in wartime calculus. Anna Morales had covered hearings where scientists testified about theoretical possibilities, and she carried both transcripts and the impatience of a journalist who saw public consequence in private mutations. Scientific description in the flat stayed accessible and guarded. Eleanor spoke of fission as a process where a heavy nucleus, when induced, splits and liberates a cascade of neutrons and energy. She explained isotope separation in plain terms, isolating a particular variant of an element from others so a reaction could be sustained. Tanaka spoke of chain reactions like dominoes, of moderation and control, of critical mass as a condition, not a command. Colonel Reed, who had read operational briefs, preferred concise technical contours with caveats about scale and delivery. None of them spoke in procedural detail. The terms they used described phenomenon, not instruction. The disagreement was not over physics as such, but over the translation of measurable effect into policy. They remembered early experiments. Jameson at the college, who had insulated a chamber with a careful hand. Sarah Whitaker, who filed reports late in the night, and Tomo Ishikawa, who had held vials and trembled at the brightness of a small release in a test. Together, the recollections formed a lattice of responsibility that was as social as it was technical. The central debate unfolded at the table like a slow, inevitable experiment in human consequence. The main scene became a long exchange, in which each voice tested the limits of culpability and the meaning of responsibility. We taught students to think by thought experiments. We did not teach them to predict politics. In Kyoto, I watched my teacher measure soot and wonder if numbers could be forgiven. You gave us the possibility. We chose the means. There is a difference between making knowledge and enabling harm. Not if that knowledge can be weaponized by calculation. We signed papers that said data only. We did not sign for orders, but our calculations are used by those with different motives. So who holds the ledger? The state, for now, and the conscience of those who created the ledger. Do you think hiding it would have saved anyone? Silence has a cost, too. Yuki Sato, Hiroshi's sister, who had arrived unexpectedly and stood at a window, pressed her palm to the glass and said nothing. The exchange continued, at times overlapping, with hesitations, with hands smoothing cups, with eyes on the page not to hide emotion, but to buy time for words. That mandated density of dialogue allowed subtext to appear. Guilt, denial, fear of reputational ruin, the simple human stubbornness to justify. The conversation did not resolve into consensus, but yielded a fragile mosaic of admissions and refusals, each sentence a small fracture in previously unexamined assumptions. Throughout, sensory detail threaded the scenes. The taste of oversteeped tea lingered as a bitter undertone to confessions. The rustle of paper and the smell of old books underlined the weight of archival decisions. Outside, the city carried its own acoustics, the clop of horses on cobbles mixing with the far hum of an economy at war, occasionally punctuated by sirens that never felt far. Inside, clothing textures mattered. Eleanor's sweater that had a moth snag reminding her of domestic smallness. Reed's uniform rough with rain. Tanaka's sleeves rolled in the way of someone who still preferred hands-on experiments. Shadows played across faces as clouds passed the window. Each sensory note re-entered the dialogue as physical punctuation, reminding participants that the debate was not merely abstract. Interspersed with argument were 3 accountings of memory that deepened the moral stakes. Moment 1, a late-night trial where instruments measured nothing decisive and a junior technician wept in the corridor over a lost calculation. Moment 2, a newspaper clipping that reported a test explosion with bureaucratic elation and a photo with faces smiling at instruments. Moment 3, a letter from a field medic describing burns, and a silence where words had been expected. Each moment stretched into 500 to 600 character segments that functioned like brief experiments in tension, each urging the protagonist toward a decision. The first picked at the rawness of failure. The second confronted the glamour that had seduced some into thinking of achievement rather than consequence. The third insisted on human detail, the stench of burned fabric, the sound of someone who cannot find water, the weight of a child's hand burned to the bone. Backstory anchored the two protagonists in 3 to 4 paragraphs each so their present judgments could be traced to formative scenes. Eleanor had been born to a railway clerk in Manchester, a child who dismantled clocks to understand manners of time. She grew into scholarship at a provincial college where her fascination with metallurgy met mentors who insisted on rigor. Her doctoral years were a sequence of nights with microscopes, the slow revelation that materials could yield secrets if coaxed gently. She had lost a brother to an air raid 2 years earlier, and the absence of a son she might have had called forth a tenderness that made her reluctant to see human bodies reduced to data points. Her present manner was measured, a scientist who believed that certainty in method required humility in application. Hiroshi had been a boy on the hills outside Kyoto, listening to frogs and counting stars, later studying chemistry because it promised both poetry and precision. He moved to England in the worsening years of war to continue work, carrying letters folded like talismans, his mother scribed with ink that trembled with longing. He had watched his hometown reports and could not reconcile the small domestic rituals of his childhood with the scale of devastation now named. In laboratories, he had always preferred hands-on apparatus, the tactile assurance of glass, the coolness of a pipette. His loyalty split between the colleagues who had welcomed him and a homeland now in flames. Both backstories totaled close to 1,000 characters each and were woven into the dialogue so that present choices bore the imprint of personal history. At roughly a third of the way through the narrative, the script pauses to invite the audience into the moral fold. If you feel the mixture of shock and curiosity that these people felt, you are not alone. These dilemmas are not relics. Do you think scientists have an obligation to predict every consequence of their work? Answer with yes or no and tell us in 2 lines why. Your short responses help others see new angles and may inspire future investigations into the ethics of discovery. Now that you have given your view, continue listening. We return to the conversation that would shape reputations and policies. The room that had been an enclave of analysis became, with time, an arena of accusation. Newspapers and officials arrived like late winter storms. Ana Morales called editors and received instructions to pursue public reaction. She left to file an account that balanced technical reverence with a desire to hold power accountable. Colonel Reed spoke with military representatives who insisted on operational necessity and strategic value. Professor Lawrence Brooks convened a small meeting with Sarah Whitaker and Michael Coates to inventory documents and control narratives. Tomo and Yuki, relatives and witnesses, sought to translate private grief into public petitions. Each new named person shifted the burden of action. Conversations with secondary characters introduced social reactions beyond the flat. Journalists circulated drafts. Clergy asked whether prayer could suffice for culpability. Local officials debated censorship, and international envoys hinted at diplomatic complications. The narrative traced how knowledge migrated from bench to bureaucracy to headline, each movement amplifying responsibility. There were 3 distinct tensions expanded in consecutive paragraphs that forced decisions. The first tension concerned secrecy versus publication, the choice to withhold data in hope of controlling usage or to release findings with the belief that openness fosters moral restraint. The second tension concerned attribution and blame, who would be named in official reports and who would be consigned to footnotes. The third tension concerned reparation and silence, whether acknowledgement and aid to victims could mitigate what had been done, or whether words would remain inadequate. Each tension included internal conflict, memory that resurfaced, choices made in haste, and a decision point where action might reshape legacy. These moments culminated in a scene where Eleanor stood at a window, watching the Thames slosh against its banks, and felt the old solidity of science dissolve into a moral soup where every reagent had consequence. Reflection came in intimate scenes, short walks along Regent Street where pavement steam stitched the air, a small garden where Tanaka planted a bulb in symbolic defiance, and a cramped bedroom where Eleanor rewrote a lecture to include questions about ethics. In these passages, the backstories re-emerged in compact detail, reminding that their childhoods and losses informed their hesitations. Conversations narrowed to confessions. Eleanor to Tanaka: "When I signed papers, I believed in containment." Tanaka: "Containment is a hope, not a law." Reed: "We all acted as if someone else would fix the ethical ledger." These private moments use sensory micro-details, the weight of a pocketed photograph, the taste of a cigarette butt, because no one could sleep, the echo of a neighbor's radio that sounded like a distant verdict. The epilogue traces 3 time points and the unfolding legacy. 1 month later, a public inquiry began and names such as Brooks, Reed, and others appeared in minutes. The press debated responsibility, and the term device entered public lexicon. 3 months later, survivors' messages arrived from Japan, and humanitarian groups petitioned for aid, with Ana Morales' articles amplifying voices from devastated neighborhoods. 6 months later, policies shifted slowly. Committees formed to advise scientific institutions on ethical oversight, and Sarah Whitaker filed an archive that later scholars would consult as evidence that choices had been considered. Some included apologies, others framed the events as wartime necessity, and some reactions hardened into defense of secrecy. The consequences were uneven. Individuals faced tribunals of conscience, and institutions constructed new protocols. Awards and condemnations arrived in equal measure, creating an ambivalence that settled like dust over the scientific landscape. The closing reflection balances fact and moral weight. The discovery, once converted into action, could not be undone. Those who had measured neutrons and written reports found their instruments reflected back images of human cost. Responsibility did not vanish with time, but spread into institutions, laws, and habits of thought. The factual record shows that a city was destroyed and that policy choices followed. The moral record resists tidy judgments. Some scientists repented publicly, others defended their limited foresight. The final sentence returns to metaphor and invitation. Science opens doors, and someone always holds the key. Who will open them and to what end remains a question for every generation. If you want to continue exploring how decisions in laboratories reverberate in the world, subscribe and join the conversation.